Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Titletown Talk. I'm Ian Ewing, your host. On today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the news items that have come up here the last week or so and answer the biggest question that I've gotten the last week and a half, which is, should the Packers and will the Packers go after Myles Garrett? I have an answer for you on the podcast here, this episode later on. But first, wanted to talk about some smaller news items. The first one being, the Packers hired DeMarcus Covington for their vacant defensive line coach job. So, some of you might know, why is this significant? Let's start with that. Well, first of all, they fired Jason Rubervich. We talked about that in the first episode, and he was the only holdover from the Joe Barry era. Reminder, last year with Joe Barry, we had run a 3-4 defense, and he was in charge of the defensive line. The thing that's different about the 4-3, and a lot of you probably know this, but the 4-3, the defensive ends are actually linemen, and in the 3-4, they're linebackers, okay? So the weird thing about the way it worked before was Rubervich really wasn't in charge of the pass rush of the defensive line, right, the edge position. So there was always some thought, and this was reported by several different beat writers, that there was a lot of, I wouldn't say mistrust, but a little bit of doubt that he could handle the job. So that, on top of the fact he was a holdover from Barry, and personally, I think he was a little bit over his head. That's why this is significant. And the other thing, guys, we talked about this in the first episode too, the defensive line was probably the most disappointing position on the entire team, probably even more so than the wide receivers, which we'll talk about in a minute. The reason being, if you guys remember, in 2022 and even 23, the defensive line was a strength for the Packers. They had, Rashawn Gary was in the middle of his breakout, especially in 2022 before his injury. You were seeing, Kenny Clark have a career year in 2023. Preston Smith was still rushing. There were a ton of, and the inner defensive linemen too. Carl Brooks jumped like crazy in 2023. We saw some stuff from Colby Wooden, who I really like. And, it didn't happen this last year. To say the very least, it did not happen. So if you guys recall at the end of the season, Brian Gutekunst, the Packers GM, was asked about, where he sort of thought the defensive line was at. And just to kind of summarize, he said that we have the right guys in the room, which, obviously I'm assuming some of you might have thought this. I certainly did. Well, what does that mean? They were not good enough this last year. So how can you say they have the right guys in the room if they didn't perform? Well, reading the tea leaves, that would indicate that he thinks the coaching was a problem, and that's why they didn't why they fired Jason Rubervich. So we're going to talk a lot about this in free agency and the offseason acquisition episode coming up. I think they need to beef up that defensive line a lot more, specifically just pass rush. It doesn't need to be a defensive end. Could be Myles Garrett. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's some other players that I really like in free agency that I think they're going to be interested in. And like I said, we'll talk about that in another episode. Let's talk a little bit about DeMarcus Covington. He was the Patriots defensive coordinator under Gerard Mayo last year. He's a really highly regarded guy. He was the defensive line coach for the Patriots when Belichick was there. So I really like that he was a Belichick guy. If you look at the Patriots defensive line, he's really, Christian Barmore is a guy I really, really like. I liked him in the draft personally. I thought the Packers could even take him in round 1. He ended up going in round 2 to the Patriots, about 3 picks ahead of the Packers. Would they have taken him? I'm not so sure about that, but regardless, I'm a big fan of his, and you can really credit Covington for his development, right? Josh Uche, who I'm a huge fan of, he went to the Chiefs, ironically, playing tomorrow in the Super Bowl. The Patriots traded Uche over to the Chiefs earlier this season. The thing that's cool is if you look at the stats, the Patriots defensive line was in the top 10 in every single category every season that Covington was there. So I really like this hiring. I'm not going to pretend like this is like some sort of massive game changer or whatever, but I like the fact that he has some coordinator experience. I think this is a really important position and they need to get it right. And I think they did, right? But I think the fact that he was a coordinator, kind of just ups the ante a little bit. It gives him a little bit more credibility. It kind of takes and adds a level of ownership to that defensive line. I think it's going to raise the floor of the defensive line. And honestly, they're gonna add to that room. You guys, I swear that's going to happen. We'll talk a lot about that in the coming episodes. This defensive line that you see right now will not be the defensive line we have come the week 1 of 2025. But that being said, I really like this pickup. I think if the same guys come in there, I think he can help Lucas Van Ness develop some more. I think he can bring Rashawn Gary back from the dead. Kenny Clark, I think, is starting to decline a little bit. This is probably going to be his last season, to be transparent. But, Carl Brooks is a guy that I really, really like. He's not just a field goal blocker, even though he did that really well this year. I think in 2023, Carl Brooks I thought he was going to have a massive season this year. I think he had a little bit of a sophomore slump, but I could see him being a massive standout player in year 3 this year. Now, let's talk about Josh Jacobs' comments at Radio Row. And boy, oh boy, did this make headlines. I'm not sure if any of you guys are on the old Packers social media train, whether it's Blue Sky, Threads, Twitter, whatever. Man, Josh Jacobs made a couple of waves this week. And let's talk about what he said. So he did an interview with Pro Football Talk, Mike Florio and Chris Sims, and basically said, I think that we're 3 pieces away from being a contender. He said the same thing to Kay Adams. He said the same thing to, I think it was the ESPN guys. Either way, doesn't matter who he said it to. He did not back down. In fact, he doubled down with Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers and as well. So he thinks we need to add 3 pieces to the team, right? 2 of which are pretty obvious and innocuous, right? Defensive end, pass rusher, he said that. He said defensive back, obviously he means corner. But the third one is where the controversy came in. He said that we need to add a established number 1 wide receiver. Now, he was taken a little bit out of context with this. Some of you might have seen this. He said we need to add a real number 1 wide receiver. Now, this led to a lot of chatter, obviously, because, the Packers wide receiver room is really, really competitive. I still think the ceiling's really, really high for them, despite the fact they didn't do, what we all expected and hoped they would in 2024. Dontavian Wicks, who I personally, you guys heard me in the last episode, I think he's going to be a special player. He's going to be a star. I really believe that. I still believe that. After he saw that Josh Jacobs said this, he tweeted out a bunch of laughing faces and a thumbs down emoji. And then I believe he tweeted something else out after that he deleted. And then we saw Jaden Reed basically saying, I can't believe the fans, they, something to the effect of, they shit on us, pardon my French. I don't know. It was fairly mild, I would say, but, it kind of led to some discourse. What I was surprised by, though, there were a lot of radio media folks that were not really big fans of this. I listened to ESPN Radio a lot out of Milwaukee. Mark Tremura was a tight end for the Packers back in the 90s. He's on there with Jen Latta and then Gabe. I don't know how to say his last name. Doesn't matter. He was really upset that this was how, Josh Jacobs decided to bring this up. Now, here's the thing. I think this is really, like I said, innocuous as well. I love that he said it, right? We talked about this the last episode, guys, and we said it in the first episode too. The wide receiver room did not take a step. Okay? The only one that you could argue did would be Christian Watson, maybe first half of the season, Jaden Reed. But Christian Watson's not even going to be back till week 12. So just in and of itself, right, I think the Packers need another receiver, another body. To me, the one thing that's missing is a reliable guy who, at 3rd and 7, when they need it most, they can trust the guy to not only catch the ball, but get open against press or zone or whatever. That's why I personally think Davante Adams is the perfect receiver for that. There are other ones out there, and we'll talk about them on the next episode, in episode 4. But, man, the wide receiver room guys, they had every opportunity to seize the number 1 wide receiver position in 2024. Everybody in that room had an opportunity, right? They didn't do it, right? Like I said, if you guys disagree, please send me a message, leave a comment, whatever. Not a single receiver in that room that we think we can absolutely 100% positively rely on in 2025 to be the guy. Now, like I said earlier, I think Dontavian Wicks is going to be that guy, right? But I could be wrong, right? I'm not a genius here. And the Packers sure as hell can't go into 2025 thinking this is for sure going to happen because the evidence would suggest otherwise, right? That being said, I think it's a stone cold fact that they need to add another guy. Like I said, my preference is Davante Adams, assuming he gets cut by the Jets. Now, I actually think that that's who Josh Jacobs is talking about as well. And he kind of alluded to that in K. Adams' show. He played with Devontae. He's friends with Devontae. I think that he was really talking about Devontae as in terms of like the, established guy that can mentor the young players, really whatever, right? And like I said, as high as I am on Wicks, we can't bank on it. We cannot guarantee that any of them are going to step up. Last year they had the opportunity to, and nobody did, right? They either were the same or worse. Okay, so they need a guy. So my point being is maybe you could handle that in the locker room, right? Maybe Josh Jacobs could have kept it quiet. But I think I would take it as a challenge, right? If I'm in that wide receiver room, I'm going to be like, yo, my guy Josh called me out. Like, I'm going to work my ass off this offseason. I'm going to get better at running routes. I'm going to absolutely bust my ass this offseason, and I'm going to perform next year. Because, a leader on the team, in my opinion, the best player on offense this year, Josh Jacobs, is calling out the receiver room and that nobody's the number one. So I'm going to show him. I'm going to take that number one spot. Right? I don't know why anyone would have any issue with that, right? I'm happy that he said it. And I can't believe that there are people all over, Twitter and everywhere pissed off about it. I also can't believe that there are so many people like, yeah, we told you that you guys needed a wide receiver one. Yeah, we said it last year, right? We said we needed a guy. That's also is equally absurd as you could go, right? At the end of the season, guys, let's remember the Cowboys game. Romeo Doubs broke out, looked absolutely incredible in the Cowboys game, looked good in the 49ers game as well. Dontavian Wicks shot through the frickin' roof at the end of last year. Same with Jaden Reed. I think that going into this last year, they had other positions they needed to prioritize. And I would have been upset if they put a lot of those resources into a receiver instead of, let's just say Xavier McKinney or Josh Jacobs, right? So we can't Monday morning quarterback this. Anybody who's saying, see, I told you so, just respectfully, you're wrong. Now, that being said, you're right now. So you can take your victory lap. At the end of the day, you're just looking like an idiot. Anyway, Jordan Love also echoed those sentiments. And he probably said it in a little bit of a nicer way. He was representing Toyota at Radio Row at the Super Bowl, and a lot of people had asked him about Josh Jacobs' comments, and he was like, I love all the guys in the room. They can all be special, blah, 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 whatever. He then said, if we add another piece to a great room, the sky's the limit, whatever. He also said, I don't care who's in the room. I'm a competitor. We're going to make it happen regardless, right? Which, again, he said all the right stuff here. But I think even he knows there was a little bit of a wink and a nod there. K. Adams also brought up Devontae Adams. And he's like, Devontae's my guy. I'd love to have him here, whatever. The ESPN people brought up T. Higgins. I didn't know this, but I guess T. Higgins and Jordan Love are really good friends. We'll talk about T. Higgins in deep detail when I record this free agency episode, and we'll talk a lot about that. But anyway, in summation, I have zero issue with the fact that Josh Jacobs said it. Jordan Love definitely played the middle a little bit more, backed up his guys. But, he also left the door open that, hey, this might be a good move is to get another guy. So that's that. Let's talk about Myles Garrett. So why am I bringing up Myles Garrett? Well, I appreciate the messages. I got 3 different messages from 3 different people. My brother also said something, or maybe it was my brother. Somebody said something to me about, well, what about Myles Garrett? Myles Garrett wants to be traded, right? So let's go into where this news came from. So this week, I believe it was Monday, he released a statement saying he wants to be traded from Cleveland. He wants to go somewhere where he can actually win a title. Well, that really got a lot of Packers fans' wheels turning. I think a lot of people think, myself included, that they need a pass rusher. So, that made everybody think, oh, the Packers should do this, right? But I really want to talk about this in detail, okay? I'll kind of give you a summary in a minute. I don't think it's likely that they trade for Myles Garrett, but I think that it's a lot better of a chance than a lot of people are saying, okay? So we're going to go into it team by team and see, who has a shot for this. The first thing that has to happen, though, guys, is Cleveland actually has to agree to trade him. And Adam Schefter brought this up on ESPN Milwaukee this week. Cleveland is basically saying they don't want to trade him, that even 3 first-round picks wouldn't be enough to trade for him, which is absurd, right? They're not going to get that. But they have to actually agree to trade him first. And I think that will eventually happen, right? The player usually ends up getting what they want in this situation, okay? One thing that Adam Schefter said, though, that I wanted to bring up is it'll come down to, quote, how much of a stomach he has for chaos, right? How much chaos does he want to create in order to get his way, right? He doesn't really care about money. He's not motivated by that anymore, right? I wouldn't be either in his case. He's already on his way to the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. I think he's the best pass rusher of this generation, personally. He wants a Super Bowl, and I think anybody that has half a brain will tell you that the Browns are nowhere near competing for a title, at least for the next 3 years until his contract runs up. So to answer the first question, I think, the Browns are going to do right by him, and they're going to trade him at some point. I think they're just bluffing at this point. They're trying to drive the market up. The thing is, I don't think the teams really buy that. I think they all sort of think like, yeah, whatever. You guys will end up trading him. And I'm going to bring up the Khalil Mack trade in a second, where the Raiders traded Khalil Mack to the Bears. They pulled the same thing. What's interesting about that trade, though, is they didn't trade Khalil Mack until I believe it was September. So it was after the draft already happened, which is unusual. Khalil Mack, I don't think requested a trade that early. I could be wrong on that. But again, it's not unprecedented. The player usually gets what they want in this situation. And I do think, to answer the question above, I do think he has the stomach and he will do it. Because I think that he really wants to win a title and he is not going to win it in Cleveland. Why would the Browns move him, though? Well, let's talk about that first. I think they can get a lot of capital back. I think that half the league is going to be involved in the conversations, at least, including the Packers. The Browns are in cap hell right now, guys. I mean, I don't know if you all know this, but that Deshaun Watson deal, even before we knew that he was terrible now, it was a terrible deal. A fully guaranteed $230 million deal has never happened before. No one's ever come close to it. And to me, I don't know why Deshaun Watson was the guy that you'd give it to, right? This is after the scandals, by the way, that they traded for him, which is crazy. Those scandals alone would have been a hell no for me. And I think that all of it's true. You guys can disagree. Fully guaranteed contract. I mean, guys, we are talking about cap hell that the Browns are in. I mean, they're going to be paying, I think they pay him $70 million this year on the cap. He's not even going to play. Even when he was going to play, he was going to be terrible, right? He was one of the worst quarterbacks statistically in the league last year. So the point being, I think the Browns would be really happy to shed some of the money because they need to. We'll talk about it in a second, but Myles Garrett's cap number is not high this year. It's like $5 million. But the preceding years coming up, there's a lot, right? The other thing to remember, guys, they gave up a ton of draft capital when they traded for Watson, right? I think it was 3 first-round picks. I could be wrong on that. But there were a lot of draft picks that they could have used to stock up that team that they were not able to. So I think I think it's going to be at least 2 first-round picks for Myles Garrett. That's going to be a massive win for them. They need to, for lack of a better term, stock the cupboard again. So if he's serious, which I think he is, he's going to sit out. He's not going to play. The players have a lot of leverage in these situations. Now, I think there's going to be a bidding war for Myles Garrett, and some teams going to give up more than the Packers are willing to give up, right? That's why I really doubt this happens. I'd give it I don't know. I'm not going to put a percentage on it. The reason I think it ultimately doesn't happen, though, is because somebody is going to give away way more than they should for Myles Garrett. I don't think they should, right? I have a cap on this. We'll talk about it in a second. But the other reason I don't think that the Packers will do it and makes it tough is they've already paid Rashawn Gary. I think it's a top 10 contract. They took Lucas Van Ness at 13 overall last year. He's got 2 years left in his deal, plus a 5th-year option if they want it. That's a lot of capital and a lot of money to invest in one position. Now, granted, I think it's an important position, right? I think it's game-changing, right? But for those 2 reasons, 1, the bidding war is going to make the price outrageous for him, and 2, the Packers already have a lot of investment in those positions. I think those 2 things outweigh the positives that we're about to talk about. Some team's going to drop their pants and sell their soul for the guy, I swear. And he's worth it, to be clear. Now, here's what gives you some hope that it could happen, though. I brought up Khalil Mack a minute ago. In case you guys didn't know this, and this is true, it's been backed up by reporting. I believe it's been backed up by, Goody himself. They tried to trade for Khalil Mack back in 2018. If you remember, the Raiders ended up trading him to the Bears, right? The Bears and the Packers offered the same exact draft capital, right? And they also had both agreed to a contract with him to make him the richest defensive end in the league. It's an identical offer. But the reason the Raiders picked the Bears offer was because they knew that the Bears were going to be worse than the Packers, because the Packers had Aaron Rodgers. The Bears were coming off, I think, a 6-win season, whatever it was. So they were right in thinking, well, if the offers are the same between the Bears and the Packers, well, let's take the Bears deal because, they're going to be worse. The hilarious part is in 2018, the Packers were actually worse, but I think in 2019 specifically, the Bears were worse. So anyway, they gave up 2 first-round picks, a 3rd-round pick, and a 6th-round pick, as well as that extension to get him. Goody was willing to give that up for Khalil Mack. Khalil Mack, I think, was Defensive Player of the Year in 2017. I could be wrong on that. Either way, he was coming off an insane season, an All-Pro. I know that. So he's shown that he's willing to give up that kind of capital for a player that's worth it. And I would say that Garrett is worth it, right? And also remember what Goody said in the press conference. He said if the right player was available, he would do it. I think he might view Myles Garrett as a difference maker, the Reggie White of new, if you will. Now, again, Reggie White was a free agent. He wasn't a trade guy. Didn't have to trade for him. But, maybe he's thinking, hey, Myles Garrett is my Reggie White. This is a guy who came up under Ron Wolf, remember. Now, like I said, they paid Gary a top-of-market deal. He's got, I think, 3 years left in the deal. That's the difference between what we were talking about in 2018 and now. The Packers had a declining Clay Matthews and nobody else. I think maybe Nick Perry was on that team. No, he wasn't. Sorry. But those of you that remember Kyler Fackrell, I think 11 sacks that season. They didn't have a lot of pass rush back then. They do now, and they are confident in that room. Goody said it. Now, that is what complicates this. But let's talk a little bit more about why this might happen. This is why I have some hope that this could happen. The Browns are not going to send him to an AFC team, in my opinion, unless the AFC team is going to give up way more, right? I ultimately think that they will do everything in their power to not see him every year. And the AFC obviously is going to be a higher probability they're going to see him, right? The Raiders basically thought the same way when they traded Khalil Mack. So who would trade for him in the NFC? That's the question. Let's look at the NFC South first, okay? Now remember, he has a big contract, that's one. And 2, he wants to compete for a championship, right? Now the Browns have to agree to trade him. That's the first thing, right? I think they will. 2, they have to be willing to accept whatever trade offer there is. I don't think Myles Garrett can pick where he wants to go. I could be wrong, but regardless, let's talk about the Falcons first. They're nowhere near a championship, and I don't think they're the choice. They do need pass rush help, that's true. They have the cap space, right? But I don't think they're anywhere near a championship, and I also don't believe that they can actually improve. They have a lot of places they need to improve on that team. I don't see them being the team. The Saints are in cap hell. Like, I kid you guys not. If you don't know about the Saints cap situation, Google it. It is a mess. Hope nobody on here is a Saints fan. They are a mess. Oh, man. The Panthers, obviously, LOL. They're not even near competitive. The Buccaneers, I think, are a possibility, but that begs the question, are they really a contender? I'm not sure that they are. They have an aging roster. They have a lot of high-priced players in the defense already. Antoine Winfield Jr., for one. Vita Vea, there's a few more. So I'm not sure. Maybe the Buccaneers, that might be the team from the South. The Eagles, the NFC East, the Eagles, I think that they're pretty financially strapped. They're loaded on the D-line. They actually don't. They're like the one team that does not need the guy, despite the fact that he could obviously help. Howie Roseman, their GM, is a madman, so it wouldn't shock me if he was willing to give it up, but I'd be surprised. The Commanders make sense, but they've already invested a lot in their defensive line. They got Jonathan Allen, I believe, a few others that I can't think of off the top of my head. Plus, they have a lot of other holes to fill. They got Jaden Daniels, who I'm a huge fan of. I think he's a top 3 quarterback in the league right now. That's how high I think of Jaden Daniels. I'd take him over Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, by the way. But they also have a lot of other holes they need to patch up on defense, right? They need a cornerback, a safety, a linebacker. Their offensive line needs help. The Cowboys, they're about to pay Micah Parsons bigger than Garrett, I think. So they're not going to pay for Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons. Now, maybe they want to give up and not pay Micah Parsons. That's possible. I don't see that happening. And then there's the Giants, who are nowhere near competitive. Now we get to the NFC West. It gets a bit more interesting. The Rams have a lot of money, but they have a lot of young talent on the D-line. Jared Verse is one of my favorite players in the league. They have Byron Young. Braden Fisk, I believe, is a defensive tackle. Yeah, I don't think he's a great player. He's going to be a big focal point for them. They also haven't had any draft picks for like the last 3 to 5 years. I don't think they're actually able to refill their cupboard, to borrow that phrase I said earlier. So I doubt that they're going to be the team. The 49ers, they're trying to shed salary, and they're an aging roster. I don't think they're going to do it. Plus, again, back to the investment thing, they've already paid top of market for Nick Bosa, right? So I don't think it's going to be them. The Seahawks, not even near competitive, neither are the Cardinals. Now, that leaves us in the NFC North. And here's where it gets interesting. The Lions, I doubt it. They're about to pay Aiden Hutchinson probably a bigger contract than Myles Garrett, and they're already paying a lot of their guys. They got to pay Brian Branch soon. They just paid Aleem McNeil. They got a bunch of players they're going to have to pay. They're going to have to pay the safety. I forget his name. The safety, Kirby Joseph. Sorry, there's a ton of players on that team they're going to have to pay. They also need to upgrade at corner. I think. I don't see the Lions being the team. Now the Vikings are interesting. Investment-wise, they used the first-round pick on Dallas Turner last year. That's an interesting – I like him a lot. The interesting thing about the Vikings, though, is I don't think Myles Garrett is as valuable here as in the other places because Brian Flores, he's already proven you don't need like a top pass rusher for that team. So they might just want to spend that money elsewhere. Although what makes them interesting is they aren't paying a quarterback because they're going to be – in my opinion, they're not going to re-sign Sam Darnold. They're going to go with J.J. McCarthy. Now, the Bears are where it gets a little interesting. Now, the part that I think eliminates them is they're just not – I don't think they're anywhere near contention. Now, they might be a playoff team, borderline playoff team this year, but I don't see them being a Super Bowl contender for at least 2 seasons. Plus, they're already paying Montez Sweat, who I don't think is even in the conversation as close to Garrett, but doesn't matter. They've already paying him. I think the Bears, in the eyes of many, might be closer than I think they are. I think Myles Garrett might be like, oh, they might be a contender. You know, Caleb Williams, he's still on a rookie deal. I think the Bears are an actual possibility here, and as much as it pains me. And, you know, to go back to Khalil Mack, they've proven they're willing to do it in the past. That leaves the Packers. Now, we've got the money to do it. There's very little investment coming on offense or defense the next 2 to 3 years. This season, Myles Garrett's contract is only $5 million on the cap, like I said earlier. The Packers are real contenders. You can check that box. And like I said before, they've shown they're willing to pay top of market for a player like Myles Garrett. So it goes without saying he's a generational player. I think he's the best defensive end I've ever seen in my lifetime. I think Aaron Donald is probably better, but he's not a defensive end. He's 29 years old. He's in his prime. If he were available for what the Bears got Khalil Mack for, I would do it. So again, 2 first-round picks, a third-round pick, and a 6th-round pick. I don't think any first-round picks that the Packers could take in the next 2 seasons will be anywhere close to what Myles Garrett could bring. I think everybody agrees with that. Goody has proven that he can find starters and really good players in all rounds in the draft. The hilarious irony is that his worst picks have been his first-rounders probably, right? Outside of probably Jair and, Rashawn Gary probably. We don't know what Jordan Morgan is yet. I want to point to Justice Mosqueda and Andy Herman on the Pack-A-Day podcast last week. They made a really good point. I want to steal this. The Packers have a lot of good/really good players. They just need great players. That, to me, is the biggest argument for trading for Myles Garrett. And that's why I think they should do it. Now, that being said, if I had to make a prediction, I doubt it happens. Some team is going to outbid them, and this will be, just a memory on your podcast timeline. But that being said, I think they're going to spend money on their pass rush this offseason, whether it's Myles Garrett or somebody else. I think they're going to pick one in the first 3 rounds. There's a couple I really like in the draft. Shamar Stewart, Mike Green, James Pierce Jr. There's a couple of them I really, really like. So we'll talk about that a lot more as we get closer. Last thing really quick before we wrap up, Sterling Sharp was inducted into the Hall of Fame. I personally expected the Hall of Fame to go to Mike Holmgren, but and he deserves it, to be fair. But Sterling Sharp, I think it's awesome he got to go in. Personally, I never watched him play, but all the people in Packers media that did watch him and fans, even my dad, said he's one of the most dominant receivers that have ever played. I think had he not gotten hurt in 94, he would have played another probably 7 years, 10 years. He would have been in the Hall of Fame, probably first ballot. So he's deserved to be in this whole time. The injury has been the only reason that he hasn't made it in. So I think it's super awesome that he made it. Anyway, that's going to do it for today's episode. On the next episode, I teased it a few times in this one. We're going to do a free agency preview, and I'm super stoked for you guys to hear that one. I'll release it here in a few days. Keep sending me questions on Facebook, the podcast page. Leave a review, give it 5 stars, download it, tell your friends, all the things. Thank you guys for listening this week, and go Pack Go. We'll see you next time.